A billionaire offered me $80,000 to fix the heater in a house she barely lived in, and I turned her down flat and asked her instead for a coffee can full of bent nails that her late husband had been saving in his garage. Every contractor in the county had already been through that place. Big outfits with logos on their trucks and tablets in their hands. Guys who charged her a service fee just to walk through the door and shake their heads. And not one of them could get that old boiler to hold a flame for more than 10 minutes. And the house just sat there, cold as a tomb, with all that money and all that marble and not one warm room in it. And then a tired plumber with cracked hands and a truck that needed a new muffler, that would be me, walked down into that basement and looked at her and told her I didn't want the $80,000. I wanted a rusty coffee can full of crooked nails. The two contractors she still had on retainer about fell over laughing. She didn't, because something in the way I was standing there must have told her I wasn't making a joke, and something in it must have told her that I had known her husband. And within about half an hour of that dead furnace was going to kick on and run sweet and even and warm, that whole house for the first time in 2 winters, and not because I'm a smarter man than those fellows with their tablets. I want to be plain about that right from the jump. I am not smarter than them. But every last one of them had walked in and seen a broken machine, and I walked in and remembered a friend. But before I tell you about that coffee can, and about what it was that made a woman who could have bought the whole street sit down on a dusty basement step and cry into the sleeve of a sweater that probably cost more than my truck, do me one small favor. If you've ever lost somebody and you'd give just about anything you own to hear one ordinary little sound of them one more time, go ahead and tap that subscribe button. This whole channel's built for folks who understand. It's the small things that end up carrying all the weight. There. Now let me tell you about a man named Harlan Vance, and about the 11 years I spent crawling around under his house with a flashlight in my teeth. My name is Marcus Boone. I'm 43 years old, and I'm a plumber and a general handyman out of a little town in the hill country of central Texas, the kind of place where everybody knows whose truck is whose by the sound it makes coming down the road. My daddy ran pipe before me, mostly for the oil field housing back when there was money in that, and his daddy was a tinsmith before that. So I come from a long line of men who fixed the unglamorous parts of other people's lives. The stuff nobody thinks about until it quits. The water heater, the sump pump, the line under the slab that backs up at 2 in the morning on Thanksgiving. I learned the trade the way you're supposed to, standing in cold mud next to my old man, getting hollered at, getting it wrong, getting it right eventually. And somewhere along the way it stopped being just the thing I did to make rent and quietly turned into the thing I am. And I've got to tell you something right here at the front, because if I don't, none of the rest of it is going to land the way it actually happened to me. I buried my own father 8 months ago. Lung gave out on him after a lifetime of breathing in things he shouldn't have. I'll come back around to that because it ended up mattering a whole lot more than I ever could have guessed it would. But I need you to keep it tucked in the back of your mind the whole time I'm talking. Because every single thing I'm about to tell you, I understood the exact way I understood it, because there was a fresh patch of turned dirt out at the Boone family plot with my father's name on the stone. For 11 years I did the work on Harlan Vance's properties. Now, Harlan was a self-made man, and I mean that in the truest sense of the phrase. He'd come up dirt poor down near the border, started out laying pipe himself as a young man, same as me. And somewhere in there he got smart about land and minerals, and ended up sitting on a fortune that had more zeros in it than I can rightly picture. Built an oil services company up out of nothing but a borrowed truck and a stubborn streak. The kind of story they put in magazines. But I'll be straight with you. That is not the man I knew. Not even close. The man I knew was a fellow who'd come stand in my way while I worked, holding 2 cups of gas station coffee, asking me 100 questions about why the water did what it did, genuinely wanting to know, the way a curious boy wants to know. He had every reason in the world to hire some slick outfit out of the city to handle his houses. He had 4 of them around the county and 1 big place down by the lake. And instead, for 11 straight years, that man called a fellow named Marcus who drove a truck with a bad muffler, and he'd wait around the property while I worked just to talk. People asked him about that. One of his business partners ribbed him about it once in front of me. Asked why he had a small-town handyman doing work the family office could have contracted out for him. And Harlan, he didn't even look up from his coffee. He said, Because Marcus doesn't just fix the thing, he figures out why it broke. There's a difference between those two, and at my age that difference is about the only thing I've still got patience for. I never forgot that. And we got to be friends the slow way. The only real way, 11 years of it, one busted fitting at a time. He'd call me out to the lake house on a Saturday, when there wasn't a thing wrong with the place, just so he could hand me a beer and lean on the tailgate and complain about his blood pressure and his daughter's choice in men and the price of diesel. I came to know his hands, big square hands with 2 fingernails on the left that never grew back. Right after some accident in his 20s, he'd only half explain. I knew that his right hip ached when a norther was coming in before the weatherman knew it. I knew he hummed when he was content. This low, tuneless thing under his breath. Old country songs from when he was young and broke and happy, and he never once knew he was doing it. And I knew his houses. I knew every inch of pipe and wire and ductwork in all 5 of them better than I have ever known almost anything in this life. And most of all, I knew the lake house. The lake house was his pride. An old stone place he'd bought half falling down and rebuilt with his own 2 hands over the years before he ever got rich enough to pay other people to do it for him. He used to say that house was the only thing he owned that he'd actually earned with his back instead of his bank account, and the heart of that house, the thing he was proudest of in the whole place, was the heating system. Now I know how that sounds. Who's proud of a furnace? But you've got to understand, this was an old radiant boiler system, the kind they don't hardly build anymore, copper and cast iron, water moving warm through pipes in the floor and the walls, and Harlan had restored the original boiler himself and babied it for 20 years. He used to put his bare hand flat on the floor in January and grin like a kid because the stone was warm. I'll tell you one small thing about him because it tells you the whole man. The first winter I worked on that boiler, I stayed out there past midnight on a Friday, chasing an air pocket and a line that nobody else could have found. A tiny thing, a quarter turn of a bleeder valve in a closet most people forgot was even there. Most homeowners would have just turned up the thermostat and lived with the cold spot. Harlan noticed. And when I finally bled that line and the whole north side of the house came up to temperature, I didn't charge him for the extra hours because, honestly, I'd enjoyed the hunt. He found out what I'd done a week later, and he didn't argue with me about the bill because he knew better. Instead, he showed up at my shop the next Saturday with a brisket he'd smoked himself and a bottle of something I couldn't pronounce. And he said, "A man works past midnight on my house for free. I don't insult him by handing him cash. I feed his family." That was Harlan. He passed last spring, heart fast in his sleep, which is about the only mercy in the whole thing. And I went to the funeral and stood at the back in the one suit I own, the one I'd just worn to my own father's service 2 months before, and I shook his daughter's hand in the receiving line and told her I was sorry for her loss and that her dad was a good man. And she looked at me the polite blank way you look at a stranger, because to her that's what I was. Just one more calloused hand in a long line of them. I didn't expect to ever hear from that family again. People like me don't, usually. We fix the pipes and then we disappear back into the background of rich people's lives like we were never there. So you can imagine my surprise when, about 4 months after the funeral, I got a call from a number I didn't know, and it was Harlan's daughter, and her name was Eleanor Vance, and she sounded tired in a way that money can't fix. Now here's the thing I learned over those next few weeks. Harlan had left that lake house to Eleanor specifically. Not the company, not the fortune, that all got divided up among the family and the lawyers in ways I'll never understand. But the lake house, the one he built with his back, he left to her by name. And the trouble was, the heating system had quit. Sometime over the winter, with the house sitting mostly empty, that beautiful old radiant boiler had gone cold and stubborn and refused to come back. And Eleanor, who I came to understand had not been close to her father in those last years, not because she didn't love him, but because of the ordinary stupid distance that money and pride and busy lives put between people, Eleanor could not bear to let that house go cold. It was the one place she had left where she could still feel him. She'd had people out, of course. She had money, so she did what money does. She threw it at the problem. The big HVAC outfits came in their wrapped trucks and they looked at that old system and most of them wanted to rip the whole thing out and put in some modern forced air setup. And the ones who didn't, the ones who at least respected the old system enough to try and fix it, they couldn't make it hold. They'd get it lit and it'd run an hour and quit. They told her it was the heat exchanger. Then they told her it was the circulator pump. Then they told her it was the controller board. And she spent more money than I'll see in 5 years. And that house stayed cold as a grave. And then one of the outfits that had been out 3 separate times, told her flat out the system was beyond saving, that no part for it had been made in 30 years, and that the only real answer was to gut it. And something about that, the word gut, the idea of tearing out the thing her father had built with his own hands, that's what finally broke her. That's when somebody, an old fishing buddy of Harlan's who still lived out on the lake, mentioned that there used to be a local fella her dad always used, a handyman, Marcus something, and she found my number. When I drove out there, I about didn't recognize the place. Eleanor had every light on like she was trying to scare the cold out of it with brightness, and there were 2 contractors there already, a younger guy and an older one, both from some firm in Austin, both of them holding tablets and wearing the kind of clean boots that have never once stood in a flooded crawl space. They'd been retained to do the gut job, the demolition, and they were there measuring for it. And Eleanor stood in the middle of all that with her arms wrapped around herself, and I swear she looked like a kid who'd been told there's no Christmas this year. She offered to pay me before I'd even taken my coat off. Just blurted it out. She said there was a standing offer, $80,000, to anybody who could get the original system running again before they tore it out, and that the firm had already told her it was impossible and she'd half accepted it. But she had to try one more thing, and would I just look? $80,000. I want you to sit with that number for a second because I sure did. That is life-changing money for a man like me. That is my daughter's whole future in one check. And I told her I'd go look at the boiler. I went down into that basement, and the second I came down the stairs and smelled it, that particular smell of cold cast iron and old copper and stone, 11 years came back to me all at once. I'd been in that basement 100 times. I knew that system the way you know an old friend's handwriting. And I started going through it, and everything those Austin boys had done was technically correct. They'd checked the right things. New pump, they'd put a new circulator on it. New controller, the board was brand new. They'd done it all by the book. And the book was wrong, or rather, the book didn't know, Harlan. Because here's what I knew that they couldn't have. That old boiler had a quirk. It had always had it. The pressure relief on the original tank was a hair touchy. Had been for 20 years, and Harlan and I had worked out years ago that you had to set the system pressure just slightly lower than the spec sheet said by about 3 pounds, or the whole thing would lock itself out on a safety fault and refuse to fire, thinking it was overpressured when it wasn't. It was an old sensor telling an old lie, and the 2 of us had just learned to live with the lie instead of fighting it. He used to call it the boiler's bad mood. Those modern boys had come in and set everything to factory spec by the book, exactly right. And the boiler had thrown its little fit and locked itself out, and they diagnosed a dozen expensive things that weren't wrong, while the actual answer was 3 pounds of pressure and a story only a dead man and I had ever known. I could have fixed it in 20 minutes and let them think I was a genius, but that's not the part of this that matters. Because when I came up out of that basement and Eleanor looked at me with those exhausted, hopeful eyes and asked me if I could do it and what it would cost, I heard myself say something that surprised even me. I told her I didn't want the $80,000. I told her I wanted a coffee can. The younger contractor actually laughed out loud. The older one did that thing where he turned it into a cough, and Eleanor just stared at me. And I said, Eleanor, when they cleaned out your father's workshop in the garage out there, the one he kept locked, did anybody throw anything away yet? Was there an old coffee can, a Folgers can, red, all rusted around the rim that he kept up on the shelf over his workbench, full of bent-up old nails and a few screws? And her face changed, because she knew the can. Of course she knew the can. It had sat on that shelf her whole childhood. I want that can, I told her. That's my price, the whole price. You should have seen those 2 contractors look at each other. The old fool wants a can of rusty nails instead of 80 grand. And I let them think it, because they were never going to understand it anyway, and I didn't owe them an understand it anyway, and I didn't owe them an understanding. But I owed owner one. And so this is what I told her, sitting down on that dusty basement step beside her, because by then she'd come down the stairs after me and sort of folded down onto that step like her legs had quit. I told her that her father, when he was teaching me the ins and outs of that lake house all those years ago, used to keep a coffee can of salvaged nails on the workbench. and that whenever he pulled a nail out of something during a repair, an old framing nail, a finished nail, anything that wasn't too far gone, he didn't throw it away. He straightened it out with a few taps of a hammer on the vise, and he dropped it in that can. And I'd asked him once why a man with his money saved bent nails when he could buy a whole box of new ones for $4 at any hardware store in the county. And he'd looked at me, and he'd said, "Marcus, when I was a boy, we didn't have $4. My father saved every nail he ever pulled, straightened every one, and we built what little we had out of other people's leftovers. A new nail is just a nail. A straightened one is a thing that somebody decided was worth saving. I don't keep them because I'm cheap. I keep them to remember I wasn't always rich." And then I told her the part that I think is the part she really needed to hear. I told her that the very last job Harlan and I ever did together, the autumn before he died, was hanging a gate on the fence line down by the water, and we ran short a couple of nails right at the end of the light, and rather than drive all the way into town, he climbed up and got that coffee can down off the shelf, and we finished that gate with two of his father's straightened nails, and he laughed about it, and he said, "Look at that. My old man helped me hang this gate 50 years after he died." And then he hummed all the way back up to the house. That gate is still standing. I drove past it on the way in. "Sir, no," I told her. "I did not want $80,000 to fix your father's house. Charging you to walk down into a place where I can still hear that man humming, where I can still feel him in every fitting I ever turned alongside him. That would have felt to me down in my gut exactly like billing a grieving daughter to spend one more afternoon with her dad, like standing at his grave with my hand out. I didn't come out here for the money. I came because somebody I cared about for 11 years lived in the bones of that house. The same way somebody she'd loved her whole life lived in it, and you did not put a price tag on handing a person their father back for an afternoon. I just wanted the can," I told her, "because I'd love the old man too in my own plain way, and I wanted one rusty, worthless, overlooked thing that his hands had reached into 1,000 times. That was payment enough for me. That was a fortune." Then I went back down and I dropped that system pressure 3 pounds, and I bled the line in the closet everybody forgets about, and I held my hand flat against the cold stone floor the way Harlan used to, and I waited, and that old boiler shuddered and caught, and the burner came up blue and steady, and somewhere under the floor the water started to move warm again through pipes a dead man had laid with his own hands, and the cold started lifting out of that house room by room like something letting go. And Eleanor Vance, who could have bought every house on that lake, sat down on a dusty basement step and put her face in the sleeve of her sweater and cried like the cold leaving the house was the cold leaving her too. Now, I told you at the start this isn't a fairy tale, and I meant it, but the honest truth of how it ended is somehow better than any fairy tale would have been. Eleanor would not, in the end, let me walk out of there with just a coffee can. But here's the thing, and this is the part that tells you she'd actually heard me. She didn't insult the whole moment by trying to force that $80,000 into my hand either, because by then she understood me well enough, after 1 hour on a basement step, to know that the check would have cheapened the only real thing that had passed between us. So instead she did something I'm honestly still not all the way over. She asked me about my work, about my dad's trade, 3 generations of Boone men with their hands in cold mud, and about whether I had family. And I told her about my girl. I haven't told you about Lucy yet. Lucy is 9 years old, and she is the entire reason I get up in the cold dark every morning of my life. Her mama left when she was 3, and it's been just the 2 of us in a little rent house ever since, and I'd be lying if I said it's been easy because there's no part of doing it alone that's easy. She was out in the truck that whole afternoon, as a matter of fact, working through a library book in the cab with the heater running because it was a Saturday, and Saturdays are mine and hers. And when Eleanor found out I had a little girl and that I was raising her by myself on what a small-town handyman pulls in, which some months is plenty and some months is prayer, she did the quiet, dignified, exactly right thing that I've come to think only people who've really been changed by something are even able to do. She didn't write me a check. She'd finally understood why she couldn't. Instead, she hired me on. Properly. She put me on a real retainer to maintain all 5 of her father's properties, the way Harlan always had, except now it's a contract with a number on it that means I will never again lie awake on the first of the month doing math I don't want to do. and she told every wealthy friend she had on that lake about the only man her father ever trusted with the things he built with his hands. And inside of a year, I had more steady work than I could handle. The good kind. The kind where people don't blink at a fair bill. I had to hire on a young fella to help me, a kid who reminds me of myself at 20. And my Lucy. My Lucy has a college fund now with her name on it. Eleanor set it up quiet, no fanfare, said it was the least her father would have wanted, and she did it in a way I was actually able to accept with my spine still straight, as one grieving person to another, with both of us keeping our dignity whole. And here's the part that matters to me the most. When I lie awake and turn the whole strange thing over, my Lucy's future is steady now, the way 3 generations of Boone men with mud on their knees never quite managed to make it steady. The chain didn't break, same as Harlan's didn't break, because Eleanor lives out at that lake house now, full-time, and she keeps the heat on all winter, and she told me once that on cold mornings she still puts her bare hand flat on the warm stone floor, just like her daddy used to, just to feel him. She hardly even uses most of the house, she said. She just likes knowing it's warm. I'll never be a rich man. I once held a rusty coffee can full of bent nails in my 2 hands instead of $80,000 in cash, and I have not regretted it for 1 second of 1 single day since. Because there's a version of that afternoon where I take the money and I'm just a clever plumber who solved a hard problem and drove home that night a whole lot richer. And there is no version of that afternoon where I do that and also still get to be the man who sat on a cold basement step and gave a grieving daughter her father back for an afternoon. No charge. The way grief is supposed to be honored. With reverence. Never invoiced. I keep that coffee can up on the shelf over my own workbench now, and every time I pull a nail out of something and it's not too far gone, I tap it straight on the vise and I drop it in the can, the way Harlan did, the way his daddy did before him. And I think about a man who hired a fellow with a bad muffler for 11 years because I figured out why things broke instead of just fixing them. And I think about my own dad, gone now, and the particular way he used to clear his throat from 2 rooms away so you always knew exactly where he was in the house. A sound I will not ever hear again and didn't know to miss until it was gone. And I think that maybe the whole point of a life spent with your hands on broken things is finally learning that the rustiest, cheapest, most overlooked object in the whole room is real often the only one in it that was ever holding any love at all. That night I tucked my Lucy into bed and she asked me, sleepy, if I'd fixed the rich lady's big house because she'd seen it through the truck window and been impressed by how big it was, and I told her I had, and she asked if it was hard, and I said, no, baby, it was about the easiest thing in the world. I just remembered somebody. She didn't know what I meant, and that's all right. She will someday. A long, long time from now. If there's any mercy in this world, my girl is going to lose somebody she loves too. And she's going to find herself standing somewhere quiet and aching to hear one small, ordinary, vanished sound just one more time. And on that day, she'll understand every word her old man ever meant by it. I pray it's a long time off, but she'll have the trade, and she'll have that coffee can someday, and she'll understand. So let me ask you just one thing before you go. A whole string of experts with clean boots and new tablets walked into that house and saw a broken machine, and one tired plumber walked in and remembered a friend, and that right there is the whole difference between an $80,000 demolition and a coffee can full of straightened nails. So here's what I honestly want to know from you tonight. What is the small, ordinary sound, the clearing of a throat, a hummed song, a screen door banging shut, that you'd give just about anything to hear one more time from somebody you've lost? Tell me about it down in the comments. Say their name if you want to. I read every single one. And if this one got to you tonight, if you believe the way I've come to believe it right down to the ground, that love hides itself in the smallest, most overlooked things, then do me that one favor. Tap subscribe if you haven't. Leave your story down below, and I'll see you in the next one. The thing I keep coming back to is how close I came to walking out of that basement a rich man and a poorer one at the same time. $80,000 was right there in the air, and every single part of that afternoon turned on which thing I reached for. If I'd grabbed the money, the boiler still would have fired. Eleanor still would have had her heat, and I'd have driven home with a check. But the only reason that house came back to life at all was that I'd spent 11 years learning a dead man's quirks instead of just his pipes. Harlan didn't pay those Austin boys any less than he paid me. But he gave me his stories, and his stories were the actual repair. That's the part I want you to sit with. The knowing wasn't an accident. It came from showing up year after year, paying attention to things nobody was paying me to notice. And the can. I think about why I asked for the can instead of the cash, and the honest answer is that I'd have hated myself for the rest of my life if I'd put a price on standing in that man's house. There are doors money cannot walk through, and the worst mistake those clean-booted experts made wasn't technical. It was that they couldn't tell the difference between a thing that's broken and a thing that's grieving. You don't bill a grieving daughter for an afternoon with her father. You just don't. And the strange mercy of it is that because I wouldn't take the $80,000, Eleanor handed me something steadier than a check ever could have been. Work I can count on, and a future for Lucy, and she did it in a way that let me keep my back straight. But none of that mercy shows up if you quit. That's the piece people leave out. I crawled under that man's houses for 11 years in cold mud, and I buried my own father 2 months before any of this, and I drove out to that lake on a Saturday that was supposed to be Lucy's because something in me said, go look one more time. The easy thing, the soft thing, would have been to let those firms tear it all out and call it impossible. Most folks would have. What I want for my Lucy, more than the college fund, is for her to learn that the meaningful things almost always ask you to keep going after the smart money's already given up. So here's what I've landed on. Sitting up late with that rusty coffee can on the shelf above my workbench, do right by people even when nobody's keeping score, because the scorekeeping was never the point. Pay attention long enough to actually understand a thing instead of just fixing it, because understanding is what survives the people you love. And don't quit on the hard, unglamorous work, because that's where the whole life is hiding. Harlan taught me all three without ever once sitting me down to teach me anything. He just lived it in front of me for 11 years, and then he left a can of straightened nails to make sure I never forgot.